Good afternoon. Morning, actually. The first item of business is general questions. And at question number 1, I call Jamie Green.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what discussions it has had with SEPA regarding how it will address any environmental concerns that arise from new waste incineration sites that have already received approval.
Minister Alistair Allen.
As a statutory consultee to the planning process and as Scotland's environmental regulator, SEPA considers the environmental operation and management of waste facilities. This is a duty independent of the Scottish Government. Through SEPA permits, waste incineration facilities must apply best available techniques, which were recently reviewed to limit emissions. These new limits are now in force at all operational facilities. SEPA requires incinerator operators to publish emission results and undertake their own monitoring to verify those results. SEPA addresses non-compliance in accordance with its enforcement policy.
Green.
Can I thank the Minister for that helpful update? He may be aware of a new site in Irvine on the West Coast, which has been given planning permission before the moratorium came into play. That permission was granted during COVID. Many local campaigners felt that consultation wasn't quite adequate during that process. SEPA is yet to grant its operating permit for its opening, and I recently met with campaigners outside of Parliament who are concerned that local voices and concerns about the site are yet to be answered and that consultation and information sessions are not taking place with the operator of that new site. Can I ask the Minister to encourage its owners to engage with local community activists and also for SEPA to take this into account when assessing whether or not to grant a permit?
Minister.
I think it's fair to say that I would be reluctant to intervene in a conversation that SEPA is already having around an operation licence. Suffice to say that I would expect that communities would be involved in all those conversations. I think what I would add to that would be to say, and that the member alludes to this, is that no new planning permissions have been granted since the publication of the review on this matter, and that continues to be the Scottish Government's policy nationally.
Brief supplementary, Claire Haughey.
Alongside Blantyre, Cambuslang and Halfway community councils, I campaigned successfully against a proposed incinerator in Hamilton, and I know that many local people welcomed the Scottish Government's announcement of a moratorium on new incinerator sites. Can the Minister update Parliament on the actions the Government are taking to limit and reduce the amount of waste sent to existing incinerators?
Brief response, Minister.
We have met our target to reduce total waste in Scotland by 15% against 2011 levels. For the past 2 years, our recycling rate in Scotland of 62.3% in 2022 is our highest since records began. This Government has made a significant investment to modernise recycling in Scotland.
Brief supplementary, Mercedes Vialba.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Protecting our environment and communities from pollution and waste should be a priority of the Scottish Government. Waste management hierarchy lays out how waste should be first prevented, then reused, recycled, recovered and only then disposed of. Energy from waste incinerators should be the last step before disposal. During the passage of the Circular Economy Bill, Scottish Labour fought for a legal requirement to adhere to the waste management hierarchy. But how is the Scottish Government working to ensure waste management hierarchy is followed in managing Scotland's waste?
Minister.
Well, as I mentioned, there are independent mechanisms by which some of this is overseen, and certainly the targets that the Scottish Government has set itself are exacting. But Scotland has made significant progress in, as I mentioned, reducing waste. The overall recycling rate in Scotland of 62.3% is at its highest since records began. And official statistics show that we now landfill less than a quarter of all waste. There is clearly much still to be done, and the member mentions that, but I believe Scotland is making significant progress in the right direction.
Question number 2, Evelyn Tweed.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what consideration is being given to increasing community resilience and supporting their ability to respond to storm-related disruption, such as power outages.
Minister Alistair Allen.
The Scottish Government supports communities by providing national guidance to Scotland's statutory emergency response organisations, as well as advice and online learning through the Ready Scotland website and public information campaign, and convening online and face-to-face events with communities and voluntary organisations to support the sharing of best practice. Within Scotland's established resilience partnership arrangements, local authorities are the main link to communities, supporting them in developing emergency resilience activities and plans, including for significant power outages. During Storm Éowyn, local authorities, power companies, voluntary sector organisations and other local responders rose to the challenge and supported communities across the country.
Evelyn Tweed.
I thank the Minister for that answer. Storm Éowyn left many without power for days. Communities relied heavily on local authorities, energy companies and charitable support during this time. To ask the Scottish Government what steps are being taken to help communities support themselves during a significant power outage.
Minister.
Well, as I mentioned, the support is there through a number of channels, but the supporting and building community resilience is key to all of this, and we would recognise as a government that communities are best able to address their own priorities. But it's worth saying too that at a national level, the Scottish Government, through agencies like the Civil Contingencies Division, facilitates that conversation and that work through the National Voluntary Sector Resilience Partnership.
Thank you. Question number 3, Michael Mara.
To ask the Scottish Government what support it can provide to Dundee Heritage Trust to ensure the long-term future of the organisation.
Cabinet Secretary Angus Robertson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm aware of the challenges facing Dundee Heritage Trust, which is a very important organisation responsible for the RRS Discovery Ship and the Verdon Works Museum. I also recognise the challenges faced by heritage organisations across Scotland, which is why we're continuing to support the sector through £4.2 million of funding in the draft 2025-26 budget to Museums Galleries Scotland and the development of a new £4 million Culture and Heritage Capacity Fund. We're continuing discussions with the Trust and Dundee City Council with a view to the future.
Michael Mara.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that response, and I welcome the conversations I know that he has had with the Trust. They do vital work in preserving Dundee's key tourism landmarks, as just importantly my community's heritage for the next generation, including the Royal Research Ship Discovery and the Verdon Works Museum. Without the Trust, Dundee City Council will be left with a very beautiful, very large and very old ship, but no one to care for it and no money to preserve it. Can the Cabinet Secretary set out what he can do, given that the budget for this organisation has been set today, to actually give them some assurance that the Government can assist?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I think Michael Mara makes very powerful points, and these have been the subject of discussions with the Dundee Heritage Trust, with the leader of Dundee City Council, Mark Flynn, and also with the constituency MSPs and MPs, and I'll make sure that he is updated on progress as well. Hopefully he appreciates the important additional funding allocations for Museums Galleries Scotland and the new £4 million Culture and Heritage Capacity Fund, so hopefully he'll vote for that next week.
Maurice Golden.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. One of the ways to provide resilience to Dundee Heritage Trust and heritage sites more generally is to boost visitor numbers. In that regard, would the Scottish Government explore a visitor incentive scheme for Tayside, as well as share best practice on interactive displays and exhibitions from iconic venues such as the National Museum of Scotland to smaller venues?
Cabinet Secretary.
I am very open to any suggestions of the kind that Maurice Golden has made. I welcome it very much, and I'd be grateful if you could forward on any thinking about that. There's also the potential for integrated travel with visitor opportunities, and there's also the work that we're trying to do with festivals. I know we're talking here very specifically about locations rather than festivals, but I do think bringing together public authorities in supporting the heritage and cultural scene is part of the answer to the challenges that they're facing, as well as the additional funds that I hope Maurice Golden will vote for in the budget next week.
Question number 4, Michelle Thompson.
To ask the Scottish Government what support it is providing to local authorities to sustain and expand Gaelic medium education.
Deputy First Minister.
Well, we are committed to support the growth of Gaelic medium education throughout Scotland. A range of measures are in place to promote this growth, including capital and revenue funding, the provision of resources, professional support for Gaelic medium education teachers, guidance for local authorities and support for parents. In addition, a range of additional measures will be included in the Scottish Languages Bill, which is currently making progress through the Scottish Parliament.
Michelle Thompson.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that response. Falkirk Council are due to make a decision on the removal of transport provision for pupils attending GME in neighbouring local authorities and are currently engaging on the implications with Bord na Gaillimh. As ever costs are consideration, £13,000 is provided directly by the Scottish Government to cover costs, whilst the actual cost of the authority in 24-25 was £83,000. Given the Scottish Government's commitment to enhance opportunities for GME, what specific measures can the Cabinet Secretary outline to combat the significant shortfall in transport funding, which does threaten opportunities for learners?
Deputy First Minister.
I say at the outset that my hope is that this can be resolved in a way that allows young people from Falkirk Council to continue to have access to Gaelic medium education provision. My officials have been in touch with the Council on this matter, and as you say, I understand that any decision on this has been delayed for at least a month. The Scottish Government does provide £13,000 directly to Falkirk Council to support transport costs, and further to that, we've invited the local authority to work with us in relation to their Gaelic grant bids for next year, including in relation to school transport. Local authorities will receive additional support based on their need to transport Gaelic medium education pupils to neighbouring authorities, and in respect of Falkirk Council, that equates to an additional £19,000 to their local government settlement for 25 and 26. I'm happy to keep the member updated on the progress of those discussions.
Question number 5, Gordon MacDonald.
To ask the Scottish Government what impact trade barriers have on the Scottish economy.
Deputy First Minister.
Trade barriers can pose significant challenges to our economy by restricting international trade, depending on the countries and the products or services affected. Addressing trade barriers is important for economic growth, making it easier for Scottish businesses to trade, improving efficiency and reducing costs and prices.
Gordon MacDonald.
I thank the Deputy First Minister for that answer. Recent analysis suggests that Scottish exports could be lowered by approximately 7%, compared to if we had continued EU membership, equating to a loss of around £3 billion. Sectors like chemical and pharmaceuticals, where output is down 9%, computer and electronics down nearly 8%, and agri-foods down 5%. What representation has the Scottish Government made to the UK Government about forging closer cooperation with the EU to mitigate these impacts and reduce the trade barriers currently in place?
Deputy First Minister.
Well, as the member has set out, it's quite clear from the statistical evidence that Brexit has had a severe impact on Scotland's economy. Economic analysis like that provides further evidence of the scale of that impact. It's been a major contributor to food prices going up. It's wiped billions of pounds from the economy and tax revenues compared with EU membership, money which could and should have been spent on our NHS. We continue to engage with the UK Government as they attempt to repair EU relations and support action to improve the trading environment, especially a sanitary and phytosanitary agreement for our food, drink and agricultural sectors, and regulatory cooperation to improve the conditions for trade. But as the member, I'm sure, will agree with me, the best relationship that Scotland can have is within the EU.
Thank you. Brief supplementary. Murdo Fraser.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. What assessment has the Scottish Government made of the cost to the Scottish economy of ripping us out of the UK single market and erecting trade barriers such as a different currency with our nearest neighbours and our largest marketplace?
Deputy First Minister. It's a classic Conservative approach to ignore the damage that is currently being wrought on our industries and our businesses, the very same industries and businesses that the Conservatives like to proclaim they represent, and yet turn a blind eye to the current damage on Scots, on our workers, and indeed a major contributor to the cost of living crisis that we are all grappling with.
Thank you. Question number 6, Stuart McMillan.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government whether it will provide an update on the representations that it has made to the UK Government regarding reimbursements to the public sector in Scotland due to the increase in employer national insurance contributions.
Cabinet Secretary Shona Robertson.
I have raised our concerns with the UK Treasury about the impact on public services if this reserved tax increase is not fully funded. The First Minister and COSLA President also wrote to the Chancellor on the 3rd of January, supported by 48 public and voluntary sector organisations, demonstrating wide-ranging concerns across Scotland. The Treasury has confirmed that we will only receive a Barnett share of funding for UK departments, and this will undoubtedly fall far short of what is needed, and I will be raising this further with the Chief Secretary of Treasury when we meet next week.
Stuart McMillan.
Thank the Cabinet Secretary for that reply. And the Cabinet Secretary will be aware that a delegation from Inverclyde Council, including the Chief Executive and Council Leader, recently travelled to London to have discussions with the UK Government about support for Inverclyde. With increases to the employer's national insurance contributions affecting every council budget, including Inverclyde, can the Cabinet Secretary advise if she has received any feedback that this issue has been raised and if there has been any movement from the UK Government on this policy?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I'm not aware of any outcome to the meeting that Stuart McMillan referred to, but in order to provide some certainty for councils in Scotland, I announced an additional £144 million for local government. That's equivalent to a 5% rise in the council tax, and this still clearly leaves a shortfall, and I would repeat my call to the Chancellor to fully fund the costs of this labour tax rise that will harm services and the third sector. As I said earlier, I'll be raising this issue further with the Chief Secretary of the Treasury when we meet next week.
Question number 7, Kevin Stewart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government whether it will provide an update on the impact that the UK Government's decision to raise employers' national insurance contributions will have on Scottish public services and the economy of Scotland.
Cabinet Secretary.
The UK Government decision to raise employer and national insurance contributions is undermining our efforts to support businesses in Scotland, jeopardising jobs whilst hurting employees' pay packages. The Scottish Government published updated estimates on the 18th of February of the impact of the increase in employer national insurance contributions on the Scottish public sector. These estimates indicate the combined impact on the public sector and commissioned services is over £700 million. If the UK Government's reported allocation is all that is provided, the UK Government will be shortchanging services that the public depend on by over £400 million.
Kevin Stewart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that answer. The Labour Government's employers' national insurance hike is not only a tax on jobs, it is also a tax on Scotland's public services if the UK Government continue to refuse to fully compensate the costs of the increase for our health services, for our care providers and for our schools. In our previous answer, the Cabinet Secretary said that the First Minister and the President of COSLA was joined by 48 other groups to pressurise the UK Government to see sense on this issue. Can I ask the Cabinet Secretary what she can do to increase that coalition of concern, to relay the thoughts to the UK Government and to get them to see sense on this issue and pay up for our public services?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, can I agree with Kevin Stewart that that coalition of concern, as he describes it, is very important to keep the pressure up on the UK Government and the Treasury. Because, as I set out in my answers, the changes and the hike to employer national insurance contributions does place a higher burden on businesses, the public sector and the third sector, and is fundamentally a tax on jobs that will impact the Scottish economy. And my concern, particularly around those commission services, that at the end of the day it will impact on the public sector, and that is something that is not acceptable.
Absolutely. The briefest of question 8, Christine Graham.
I've anticipated that, Presiding Officer, to ask the Scottish Government what research it has recently completed into the efficacy and standardisation of the presumption of inclusion in mainstream education.
Minister Natalie Doninus.
Our young people should learn in the environment that best suits their needs, and we continue to seek ways to improve the experience of inclusion for all of our young people, and the draft budget sets out an additional £29 million for additional support needs. Our most recent relevant analysis undertaken through the Morgan Review in 2020 found no deficit in the legislative framework for additional support for learning. Indeed, the Standards in Scotland Schools Act 2000 has clear exceptions on the presumption of mainstream education to enable children and young people to learn in a special school or in a specialist unit if that best suits their needs.
Christine Graham.
Yes, I thank the Minister for her answer and make it clear I fully support the presumption on inclusion introduced in legislation over 2 decades ago. However, I do have several cases where it simply is not working either in the interests of the child or in the interests of the class, and I know it's a balance. So can I just ask the Minister to keep this under review, because we want the child and the class to get the best out of the situation?
Briefly, Minister.
Thank you. Well, last year's Education, Children and Young People Committee led an inquiry into additional support for learning, considered these issues thoroughly. We accepted the committee's recommendations on this point and are taking further action, and I will keep the points that Ms Graham raises in mind.